A brass key that doesn't fit any lock. A woman who hasn't spoken to the man she once married in over a week. And a 6-year-old girl sleeping 4 rooms away who has no idea that this morning, in a kitchen barely big enough for 2 adults to stand in, every truth her parents have been avoiding is about to come crashing down. Grant arrived at 8. He knocked at exactly 8 o'clock because punctuality was the only language he had left that Clare might still trust. His words had failed during their marriage. His promises had dissolved like sugar in rain. But showing up at the time he said he would show up, that was something concrete, something measurable, something Clare could hold against the light and examine for cracks. She opened the door before his hand finished falling and stepped aside to let him in without a word. She wore the oatmeal-colored cardigan, the same one from every school pickup, and he noticed now that one of the buttons was missing, the third one down, leaving a gap that she hadn't had time or money or energy to fix. Dark circles lived beneath her eyes, deep enough to suggest she hadn't slept either, that the night on the beach had followed her home and kept her company until dawn. The kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people standing, a small table pushed against the wall, 2 chairs that didn't match, a window above the sink that looked out on a backyard the size of a postage stamp, where a plastic sandbox sat waiting for Sophie to wake. Clare had made coffee in a percolator that looked older than both of them, and she handed Grant a mug without asking how he took it. The mug had a cartoon whale on the side, smiling with improbable cheerfulness. He wrapped his hands around it and said nothing. Clare didn't sit. She stood with her back against the counter, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made clear this conversation would happen on her terms or not at all. "You want to know what it cost?" she asked, and her voice was steady in a way that suggested she had rehearsed these words, turned them over in the dark hours, shaped them into something she was finally ready to use. Grant set the whale mug down on the counter. "Tell me." She told him. She told him about the birth. Alone in a hospital room with fluorescent lights and machines that beeped, and no one beside her except a nurse named Iris who held her hand during the final hours, because there was no family, no friends, no one else who had earned the right to be there. She told him about holding Sophie for the first time, this perfect, impossible creature with his eyes and her chin, and thinking that he should have been the first person to see her. But he wasn't. He was somewhere else, living a life that didn't include them, making choices that had already been made for him by a woman sitting 3 feet from his desk. She told him about the emergency room when Sophie was 11 months old, burning with a fever of 104, her small body limp and terrifying in Clare's arms. She told him about the $11 in her checking account and the doctor who looked at her with something that might have been pity and might have been judgment, and was probably both. She told him about learning everything alone, fixing the leaking sink under the bathroom cabinet using instructions from a library book, cutting Sophie's hair for the first time and crying afterward because it came out uneven, teaching her to tie her shoes using the 2-loop method that Grant had somehow replicated perfectly on that sidewalk outside their cottage. First dentist visit. First nightmare. First day of school when Sophie walked through those double doors without looking back. And Clare sat in the car for 20 minutes, unable to drive because her hands were shaking, and there was no one to call, no one to tell, no one who understood what it meant to watch your child walk into the world without the other half of the reason she existed. Every milestone, every crisis, every small victory, alone. She told him about answering the question, "Where's my daddy?" hundreds of times, smiling each time and saying they were enough, the 2 of them, that some families looked different and that was okay. She told him about something dying inside her every single time because she didn't know if it was true. She hoped it was. She wanted it to be. But hope is not the same as certainty, and certainty was a luxury she couldn't afford. She told him about crying in the bathroom with the water running, thinking the sound would cover her grief, thinking the thin walls would keep her secrets. Sophie heard. Anyway, Sophie always heard. But pretending felt better than admitting she was breaking. So Clare kept pretending, and Sophie kept writing letters to a father who never answered, and the whole fragile structure held together through nothing but stubbornness and love, and the belief that if she just kept going, kept putting one foot in front of the other, kept being enough for 2 parents, eventually the ache would fade into something she could carry without stumbling. It never faded. She just got stronger. And the difference between healing and endurance is something most people never learn. But Clare Ashford had a doctorate in it. That's what it cost, Grant. Clare's voice had grown hoarse, but she didn't stop. That's what the last 4 years cost. Not just me, her, everything she missed. Every letter she sent that disappeared into nothing. Every time she asked why you didn't come, and I had to make up answers because I didn't have real ones. Grant stood very still. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain or excuse or minimize. He received her words like a man standing in open weather, letting everything hit him because he understood he had earned every drop. "You're right," he said quietly. "I know I'm right." Silence held the kitchen for a long moment. The percolator ticked as it cooled. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked, and both of them went still, listening for the sound of small feet. Nothing followed. Sophie was still sleeping. Grant set his hands flat on the counter, pressing his palms against the surface as though steadying himself against something only he could feel. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. Can you do that?" Clare's jaw tightened. She studied him with the particular wariness of someone who has learned that the words, "I need to tell you something," rarely precede good news. But she nodded once, a single sharp motion that granted permission without promising patience. "When you left," Grant began, his voice measured, careful, each word placed like a stone in a path he was building as he walked it. "I came home to an empty apartment. Half the furniture was gone. Sophie's room was bare. Your note was on the counter, and the spare key was beside it. And I stood in that kitchen for I don't know how long. An hour, maybe 2. I couldn't move. I kept thinking you would walk back through the door and tell me it was a warning, a wake-up call, that you just needed me to see what losing you felt like." He paused. Clare's expression didn't change, but her fingers had tightened around her crossed arms. "You didn't come back, and I understood, eventually, that you weren't going to. So I started looking. The next morning, I hired investigators, the best I could find. People who locate missing persons for governments and corporations. People with resources and technology and connections that most civilians don't have access to." Grant met her eyes. "They found nothing. You were meticulous, Clare. No credit cards, no forwarding address on file, no digital footprint. Every trail went cold within the first month. I spent millions over 4 years. I personally visited every place you ever mentioned wanting to live. Every town we talked about on those nights when we used to lie in bed and imagine different lives. I went to 12 states. I went to places I'd never heard of before, places where the locals looked at me like I'd landed from another planet. I showed your photograph to strangers in diners and post offices and grocery stores. Nobody recognized you. Nobody had seen you." Clare's face had gone very still. Not the guarded stillness of the past week. Something different. Something that was recalculating. "I grieved you," Grant said, and the word came out, rough-edged, scraped raw. "Both of you. I grieved like you had died, because that's what it felt like. The not knowing, the complete silence. I would wake up at 3 in the morning and reach for my phone, thinking maybe today there would be a message, a voicemail, even a hang-up call from a number I didn't recognize. Something. Anything. Proof that you were still alive, that Sophie was growing up somewhere safe, that the 2 people I loved most in the world hadn't simply ceased to exist." He opened his hands, palms up, a gesture of emptiness that was also, somehow, a gesture of offering. "I carried one photograph, Sophie at 2 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. I kept it in my desk at the office in the second drawer behind the files where no one would see it. Every night before I left, I would take it out and look at it and wonder what she sounded like, whether she still laughed like that, whether she had your voice or mine, whether she knew I existed at all." Clare had not moved from her position against the counter, but something fundamental had shifted in her posture. The armor was still there, the crossed arms, the set jaw, the careful distance. But behind her eyes, Grant could see machinery turning, old assumptions being dismantled and examined in the light of new information. "You looked for us," she said, and it was not quite a question. "For 4 years, every day. You spent millions. The money was irrelevant. I would have spent everything. Claire uncrossed her arms slowly, as though releasing a position she had held for so long that her muscles had forgotten any other shape. She pressed her palms flat against the counter behind her, mirroring Grant's posture without realizing it. "I thought you were relieved," she said quietly, "when I left. I thought you woke up to that empty apartment and felt the weight lift off your shoulders. I thought you looked at that note and felt free." The words hit Grant, like a door swung open into darkness. He stared at her, genuinely stricken, the color draining from his face in a way that no amount of boardroom composure could disguise. "Free?" he repeated, the word coming out hollow. "I was drowning in that marriage, Grant. In the penthouse that didn't feel like home, and the dinners you never came to, and the phone calls that were always more important than the person standing in front of you. And I thought, if I'm drowning, he must be too. I thought leaving was kindness. I thought I was setting us both free." Her voice cracked on the last word, the first break in her composure since she had begun speaking. "I didn't know you were looking for us. I didn't know you carried her picture. I thought—" She pressed her hand against her forehead, eyes squeezed shut. "I thought we were easy to forget." "You were impossible to forget," Grant said, "both of you, every single day." The kitchen held them in its smallness, two people standing 3 feet apart in a room where you couldn't open the refrigerator and the oven at the same time, confronting a version of their shared history that neither had imagined. Claire had spent 4 years believing Grant was relieved by her departure. Grant had spent 4 years believing Claire didn't want to be found. Both stories were wrong. Both stories had been sustained by silence and assumption and the particular cruelty of not knowing, which allows the mind to construct whatever narrative causes the most pain. Claire opened her eyes. "There's something I don't understand," she said. "If you were looking that hard, if you had investigators and resources and all the money in the world, how did you not find us? I filed a forwarding notice with the Postal Service when we moved to Bellevue. It had our address on it. It would have been in the system." Grant reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded document. He had carried it since discovering it in Renata's drawer, keeping it close the way a prosecutor keeps key evidence. Understanding that this single piece of paper held more destructive power than any weapon he had ever wielded in a boardroom, he unfolded it carefully and laid it on the kitchen table between them. Claire picked it up. Her eyes moved across the date stamp, the address, the postal markings. Grant watched her process it, watched the moment when understanding arrived, watched her face change from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like the ground opening beneath her feet. "This is dated 4 years ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This forwarding notice is 4 years old." "It was filed when Sophie was 2, Grant confirmed. "Right after you moved here. It would have been routed through the postal system and delivered to our old address, which by then was forwarding my mail to the office." "To the office," Claire repeated slowly. "To Renata's desk." The name landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Claire set the document down with exaggerated care, as though it might detonate if handled too roughly. Her breathing had changed, gone shallow and quick, the way people breathe when they are trying very hard not to scream. "Renata Voss," Claire said. "Your assistant. My executive assistant. For 8 years. The one who scheduled your life, who managed your calendar and your travel and your correspondence." Claire's voice had gone flat, dangerously controlled. The one who was always there, every meeting, every dinner, every trip. The one who knew everything about you. "Yes, she had this." Claire pointed at the forwarding notice without touching it again. "She had our address for 4 years, and she never told you." "She never told me. She filed it in a locked drawer in her personal desk along with every piece of mail that arrived from Bellevue. Birthday cards you helped Sophie make, holiday, photographs. And when Sophie started writing letters, those went into the drawer too. 61 letters over 2 years, every single one intercepted, hidden, and locked away." Claire sat down heavily in one of the mismatched chairs, her hands gripping the edge of the table, as though the room had tilted beneath her. She stared at the forwarding notice, and Grant could see her working backward through every year alone. Every night, Sophie cried for a father who seemed to have abandoned her. Every time Claire had almost packed up and moved again because something felt wrong, because she sensed that the world was arranged against her in ways she couldn't quite identify. "She watched you search," Claire said, and her voice had dropped to something barely audible. "She watched you spend millions. She watched you grieve, and she sat at her desk 3 feet away, knowing exactly where we were." Yes. Why? Grant had asked himself this question every hour since discovering the drawer. He had turned it over from every angle, examined it through the lens of professional betrayal and personal obsession, and the particular pathology of someone who confuses control with love. He had an answer, though it brought no comfort. "Because she was in love with me," he said quietly. "She told me so when I confronted her. She said she had loved me for 8 years, that she watched me carry your photograph and grieve. Your absence, and she couldn't stand it. She said she was protecting me, helping me move forward." "Protecting you," Claire repeated, and the word came out sharp enough to cut. "She stole 4 years of our daughter's life, and she called it protection. She stole 4 years of all our lives." Claire pressed her palms flat against the table and leaned forward, her eyes blazing with a fury Grant had never seen in their entire marriage. Claire didn't rage. Claire didn't shout. Claire operated with surgical precision even in her angriest moments. But what he saw in her face now was something beyond anger, something primal and protective. The look of a woman who has just learned that the suffering she endured, that her child endured, was not the result of fate or bad luck or the natural consequences of difficult choices, but the deliberate act of another human being who weighed their pain against her own desires and chose her desires. "I want to see her," Claire said, and her voice had turned dangerous. "I need to look her in the face and ask her why." "I've already confronted her," Grant said. Claire's head snapped up. "When?" "Before I came to Bellevue. After I found the drawer. I went to her apartment." "What did she say?" Grant recounted the conversation with the precision of someone who had replayed it endlessly. Renata in her silk robe the color of champagne, her apartment white and sterile and devoid of personal photographs, her initial claim of protection, her confession of love that spanned 8 years, her trembling hand at her throat when she realized he had found the forwarding notice. "I told her that what she felt wasn't love," Grant said. "I told her she loved what she could control, the narrative, the image, the carefully managed version of my life that kept me dependent on her judgment. I told her that the thing she controlled most was making sure I never found my family." "And then?" "I told her that if she contacted you, if she went near Bellevue, if she came within 100 miles of Sophie, I wouldn't send lawyers." Grant's voice carried no heat, only the measured certainty of a man who understood exactly what he was capable of and wasn't bluffing. "I told her I would use every resource, every connection, every favor accumulated over 15 years of business that people would rather keep quiet. She knows what that means." Claire studied him, her expression unreadable. "You threatened her." "I made her a promise." "There's a difference?" "In this case, no." Claire exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to carry years of tension out of her body. She leaned back in the chair, her hands dropping from the table to her lap, her shoulders lowering incrementally. She wasn't relaxing. She was recalibrating, processing this new version of events against the story she had told herself for 4 years, measuring the gap between what she believed and what was true, and finding that gap so wide it threatened to swallow everything she thought she understood about her own life. "I left because I thought you didn't want us," she said, speaking slowly, as though testing each word before releasing it. "You stopped coming home, you stopped being present. Every conversation became a negotiation, every dinner was cancelled for a meeting. I stood in that penthouse surrounded by things I didn't choose, and I thought, he has already left this marriage. I'm just the last one to know." She looked at him directly. "I wasn't wrong about that. You were disappearing. You were choosing the firm over us day after day, and I could see the end coming the way you see a train on a straight track. I left because I thought if I stayed, Sophie would grow up watching her father leave in slow motion, and that would be worse than a clean break." "You weren't wrong," Grant said, and the admission cost him more than anything he had said that morning. "I was disappearing. I was choosing the work because the work was easier. Deals have clear terms, negotiations have endings, but marriage, fatherhood, being present for another person without an agenda or a projected outcome, that terrified me. So I hid in the thing I was good at and told myself I was providing for my family, when what I was really doing was abandoning them from inside the same house. The honesty of it hung in the air between them, raw and unadorned. Claire held his gaze, and Grant saw something shift behind her eyes. A wall moving. Not falling, not yet, but moving, repositioning, creating a space where something other than anger might eventually live. So we're both responsible, Claire said. We're both responsible for the marriage failing. We're not responsible for what Renata did with the failure. That's on her. The letters, the forwarding notice, the 4 years of deliberate concealment, none of that was a natural consequence of our mistakes. That was theft. She stole time from us that we can never get back, and she stole it knowing exactly what it would cost. Claire nodded slowly. And Sophie? What do we tell Sophie? The question settled over the kitchen like a weight, because Sophie was 6 years old and she knew that her father had been gone and was now here, and she knew that her letters had been hidden, and she knew in the way that children know things without being told that the adults in her life were carrying something heavy and sharp between them. But she did not know the full shape of it. She did not know about Renata. She did not know that her father had searched for 4 years. She did not know that her mother had left believing she was unloved, and her father had stayed believing he was abandoned. Sophie knew the edges of the truth. The center was still hidden from her. We tell her the truth, Grant said. Not all of it. Not yet. She's 6. She doesn't need to understand the mechanics of what happened, but she needs to know that I didn't choose to leave. She needs to know that I was looking for her every single day. And she needs to know that the letters she wrote mattered. They mattered more than anything. Claire's eyes filled, and she blinked rapidly, fighting the tears with the practiced determination of a woman who had spent 4 years refusing to cry in front of anyone who might worry about her. She'll want to know why you didn't find her, Claire said. She'll want to know why it took so long. I'll tell her someone kept us apart. Someone who should have helped but chose not to. I'll tell her it wasn't her fault, and it wasn't your fault, and it wasn't my fault, and the person who did it made a mistake that hurt all of us. That's generous, Claire said quietly. Calling it a mistake. To a 6-year-old, it needs to be a mistake. The alternative is explaining malice, and she's not ready for that. Claire considered this, turning it over with the meticulous care she brought to every decision involving Sophie. After a long moment, she nodded. Together, she said. We tell her together, not today, not tomorrow, when the time is right, when she asks the question that tells us she's ready. Together, Grant agreed. The word sat between them on the kitchen table, next to the forwarding notice and the cooling coffee and the cartoon whale mug, and it meant more than either of them was prepared to acknowledge. Together, they hadn't done anything together in 4 years. The word was rusty, unfamiliar, like a key that might still fit a lock if someone was patient enough to work it back and forth, until the mechanism remembered its purpose. Claire stood from the chair and moved to the sink, turning on the faucet to rinse her mug. An ordinary gesture, a return to routine. But Grant noticed that her hands had steadied, that the tremor from the beach was gone, replaced by something more grounded. She was still hurt, still angry, still carrying 4 years of solitary motherhood on shoulders that had grown strong enough to bear it but shouldn't have had to. But she was no longer carrying it alone. And the difference, however small, was visible in the way she moved. I have a condition, Claire said, her back to him, water running over the mug in her hands. One condition that is not negotiable. Name it. She turned off the faucet and set the mug upside down on the drying rack. Then she turned to face him, her expression stripped of everything except absolute seriousness. You stay, all the way, no halfway, no doors left open to your other life, no running back to Manhattan when it gets hard, or when some deal needs your attention, or when you remember that you built an empire that runs on your presence. Her voice was iron-wrapped in exhaustion. You're either here, or you're not. There is no middle ground. Not with Sophie, not with me. I'm here, Grant said. That's easy to say in a kitchen at 8 in the morning. Claire crossed her arms again, but the gesture was different now. Less defensive, more evaluative. It's harder to say at 2 in the morning when she's sick and scared and asking for you. It's harder to say when the board calls and the stock drops and suddenly Bellevue feels very far from everything that used to matter. Nothing used to matter, Grant said. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The deals, the empire, the planes and penthouses, none of it felt real. Sophie is real. You're real. This is where I want to be. Claire held his gaze for a long time. Long enough that the kitchen clock ticked through what felt like several minutes. Long enough that the light through the window shifted from early gold to full morning white. Long enough that Grant understood she was not looking at the man standing in front of her, but at every version of him she had ever known. The young man who spilled wine on her sleeve, the husband who broke promises with apologies that sounded like press releases, the absent father, the searching father, the man on the bench. She was looking at all of them simultaneously, trying to determine which one was real. "I'll be watching," she said finally. "Every day, for as long as it takes." "I know. And if you leave..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The weight of it was clear. If he left again, there would be no third chance. No more letters. No more boxes under the bed. No more standing on tiptoe to reach the mail slot. Sophie would learn to close the door her mother had spent 4 years trying to keep open, and it would stay closed. "I'm not leaving," Grant said. Down the hall, a door opened. Small feet padded across the wooden floor, and Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing pajamas covered in rockets and stars, her hair a magnificent disaster of sleep-tangled curls, her eyes still heavy with dreams. She looked at Grant. She looked at Claire. She looked at the 2 mugs on the counter, and the papers on the table, and the particular quality of stillness that fills a room where important things have been said. "Is it breakfast?" Sophie asked, rubbing one eye with her fist. Claire moved first, crossing the kitchen in 2 steps and scooping Sophie onto her hip with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this motion thousands of times. "It's breakfast," she confirmed, pressing her lips against Sophie's tangled hair. "What do you want?" "Pancakes," Sophie said immediately. Then she looked at Grant over Claire's shoulder, studying him with eyes that were identical to his own. "Can he stay for pancakes?" Claire turned to Grant. Something passed between them, something that wasn't forgiveness, and wasn't trust, and wasn't love. Not yet, not in the way those words usually mean, but was perhaps the raw material from which all 3 might eventually be constructed. She was giving him permission, not to stay forever, not to reclaim a role he had lost, just to stay for pancakes, just to be present for 1 meal, in 1 kitchen, on 1 morning, and see if the world could bear the weight of it. "He can stay for pancakes," Claire said. Sophie grinned. It was the first full, unguarded smile Grant had seen from his daughter, and it hit him with the force of something he had no defense against. Not the careful, evaluating smiles from the bench, not the serious nods of approval. This was pure, unfiltered joy from a child who had just gotten exactly what she wanted. And what she wanted was so simple it made everything else he had ever pursued seem absurd. She wanted both of her parents in the same room at the same time, making breakfast. Grant rolled up his sleeves. "I should warn you," he said to Sophie, "I haven't made pancakes in a very long time." "That's okay," Sophie replied, with the magnanimity of someone granting an enormous favor. "Mama will tell you what to do. She tells everyone what to do. It's her best thing." Claire's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile Grant had seen from her since his return to Bellevue. "Get the flour," she said, pointing to a cabinet above the stove. "Top shelf, and don't use the measuring cup with the crack in it. It leaks." Grant found the flour. He found a mixing bowl with a chip in the rim, and a whisk with a bent handle, and eggs in a carton that held only 3. He found a griddle that had seen better decades, and a spatula with a heat-warped edge, and a bottle of maple syrup that was nearly empty because real maple syrup was expensive, and Claire had learned to make things last. They made pancakes. Sophie sat on the counter, legs swinging, narrating the process with her usual exhaustive commentary. The batter needed to be lumpy, not smooth, because Miss Treadle said lumpy batter made better pancakes, and Miss Treadle knew everything about everything. The griddle needed to be hot enough that a drop of water would dance on the surface, which Sophie called the sizzle test. The first pancake was always sacrificial, Sophie explained gravely. You couldn't eat the first pancake. It was a test pancake. It existed to tell you if the griddle was ready. This was a scientific fact. Grant burned the second pancake. Sophie declared it not that bad, with the diplomatic generosity of someone who had already decided to be kind about his shortcomings. Clare said nothing, but she moved the griddle slightly to the left, away from the hottest part of the burner, and the third pancake came out golden. They ate at the small table, the three of them, knees nearly touching in the cramped space. Sophie covered her pancakes in syrup until Clare gently moved the bottle out of reach. Grant ate slowly, tasting every bite, understanding that this was what he had given up. Not the penthouse, or the view, or the meals prepared by private chefs who knew how to coax flavor from ingredients that cost more per ounce than some people's rent. This, a chipped bowl and a bent whisk and a bottle of syrup running low and a child's voice filling every corner of the room with observations about batter consistency. This was what mattered. This was what had always mattered. And it had taken him 4 years and 61 unread letters and a locked drawer and a drive down a highway that seemed to stretch forever to arrive at a kitchen table, where the chairs didn't match and the measuring cup leaked and his daughter sat across from him, eating pancakes she had helped make, her eyes the same color as his. If that kitchen scene is living in your chest right now, if you're thinking about the meals that matter most in your own life, the ones that aren't about the food at all, I hear you. Drop a comment below. Tell me about the breakfast that changed something, the dinner where someone finally stayed, the meal that meant more than anyone at the table could say out loud. I read every single comment, and your stories feed this channel the same way these stories feed me. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt less like routine and more like something being built, brick by brick, morning by morning, pancake by pancake. Grant found a rhythm in Bellevue that was nothing like the rhythm of his former life. In Manhattan, his days had been measured in meetings, each one bleeding into the next, the hours vanishing into a blur of decisions and negotiations that felt urgent until the moment they were resolved, at which point they felt like nothing at all. Here, time moved differently. The hours had weight. They carried texture and sound, and the particular quality of light that only exists in small coastal towns where the buildings are low enough to let the sky do most of the talking. He walked the beach every morning. He drank bad coffee in his rented cottage. He drove to the school at 3 o'clock and sat on the bench with the peeling green paint and waited for red boots to appear through the double doors. And every afternoon Sophie emerged and ran toward him and took his hand with both of hers and told him about her day as though he were the most important audience she would ever have. She introduced him to her world systematically, the way a curator introduces a visitor to a museum's permanent collection. Each day brought new exhibits. The tide pools where hermit crabs lived in borrowed shells, the fence behind the library where someone had woven ribbons between the slats, creating a wall of faded color that fluttered in the wind. The exact spot on the beach where, if you stood at low tide and looked toward the horizon, the water and the sky became the same shade of gray and you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. That's where the world stops, Sophie told him matter-of-factly. Everything past there is imaginary. Grant didn't correct her. He wasn't sure she was wrong. The town took its time with him. Bellevue didn't rush its judgments the way cities do, didn't make snap assessments based on appearance or reputation or the car a person drove. The people here watched. They gathered information over weeks and months, compiling their opinions from 1,000 small observations before reaching a conclusion they would hold with quiet certainty for decades. Dolores at the bakery was the first to soften. It happened gradually, in increments so small they were almost invisible. The cinnamon rolls Grant received grew marginally larger each Tuesday. The look she gave him over the counter lost its sharp edge by degree, warming from suspicion to tolerance to something that might, with sufficient time, become acceptance. She never said anything about it. She didn't need to. The cinnamon rolls spoke for her. The librarian, a woman named Frances, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and spoke in the particular hush of someone who has spent so many years Around books that quietness has become a permanent feature of her personality, began acknowledging Grant with small nods when he entered the building. He had started visiting the library because Sophie loved it, and because he had discovered that Bellevue's collection, while modest, contained books he hadn't read since childhood, books he had forgotten existed, books that reminded him of the person he had been before the money and the meetings and the relentless forward motion of ambition had smoothed away every rough and interesting edge. He read to Sophie on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, sitting in the children's corner on cushions that smelled faintly of juice and crayons, his deep voice carrying softly through the stacks while Sophie leaned against his side and listened with the total absorption of a child who has been waiting a very long time for exactly this. Frances watched from behind the circulation desk, adjusting her glasses, saying nothing, her silence a kind of observation that Grant was learning to respect. The crossing guard, a retired man named Walter, who had been guiding children across the intersection of Shell Street and Main for 11 years, began greeting Grant by name during the second week. "Morning, Mr. Holloway," he would say, raising his stop sign with the practiced authority of someone who takes his responsibilities with absolute seriousness. Grant said good morning back, and they exchanged exactly those words and no others. But the greeting itself was a form of recognition, an acknowledgement that Grant existed in Bellevue's consciousness, and was being, if not accepted, then at least catalogued. Clare remained careful. She did not speak to Grant at school pickup. She didn't wave from the doorway the way she had that one Friday. She stood at a distance, watching, her expression the same controlled neutrality she had worn since his arrival, but the distance was shrinking. Grant noticed it the way a sailor notices changes in the wind, subtle shifts that most people would miss, but that, to someone paying close attention, signaled a change in direction. She began leaving the cottage door open when he walked Sophie home. Not wide open, but ajar, the screen door unlatched, as though she wanted him to know that the barrier between inside and outside was thinner than it appeared. She started placing a glass of water on the porch railing before he arrived, a small gesture that acknowledged his presence without requiring interaction. He would drink it on the walkway while Sophie ran inside, and Clare would collect the empty glass later without comment. These were not grand gestures. They were not reconciliation or forgiveness, or any of the dramatic transformations that stories usually demand. They were something smaller and more important. They were the incremental movements of a woman who had learned to trust nothing and was now, slowly, testing whether trust was something she could afford to relearn. Grant understood the process. He had spent his career reading people, understanding what they needed before they could say yes to a deal or a partnership or a leap of faith. But this was different from business. In business, understanding someone's needs meant you could move faster, push harder, close the gap between resistance and agreement. With Clare, understanding meant waiting. It meant allowing her pace to set the timeline, her comfort to define the boundaries, her readiness to determine when and whether the next step would happen. He waited. He drank the water she left on the railing. He walked Sophie home and stopped at the end of the walkway and said, "Same time tomorrow," and meant it every single time. And the days accumulated like sea glass in his pocket, small and smooth and surprisingly beautiful, each one evidence that patience, properly applied, could build something that force never could. 3 weeks into this rhythm, something changed. It was a Wednesday, and the afternoon was warm enough that Grant had rolled his shirt sleeves to his elbows and Sophie had abandoned her jacket somewhere between the school doors and the bench. They were walking home along the usual route, Sophie narrating the architecture of a spider web she had discovered in the school garden with an enthusiasm that suggested future careers in either entomology or real estate, when she stopped abruptly in the middle of the sidewalk. "Can you come inside today?" she asked, looking up at him with those matching eyes, her expression suddenly serious. "Mama's making soup. She always makes too much soup. She says it's because the pot is too big, but I think she makes extra on purpose." Grant looked toward the cottage, visible now at the end of the street, its white clapboard catching the late afternoon light. The front door was open, not ajar, the way it had been in recent days. Open, the screen door propped wide with what appeared to be a brick wrapped in fabric. He understood what he was seeing. Clare had made a decision, not a large decision, not the kind that resolves everything and changes the story in a single dramatic beat. A small decision, The kind that opens a door 6 inches wider and waits to see who walks through. "I'd like that very much," Grant said. Sophie took his hand and led him up the walkway with the confidence of someone escorting a guest into her personal kingdom. The porch steps creaked under his weight, and the morning glory vines brushed his shoulder as he ducked through the doorway. And then he was inside Clare's house for only the second time, standing in the narrow hallway where the floorboards were worn smooth and the walls held 3 framed photographs, all of Sophie at various ages, none of which included him. The soup smelled like thyme, and something deeper, earthier, the kind of smell that fills a house and makes it feel inhabited in a way that expensive restaurants and catered dinners never achieved. Clare stood at the stove, stirring with a wooden spoon, her back to the hallway. She didn't turn around when he entered. She didn't acknowledge his presence at all, but she had left the door open. She had made extra soup, and the bread on the counter had been sliced into 4 pieces, not 3. The 4th piece was the invitation. Grant sat at the small kitchen table while Sophie set out bowls with the careful concentration of someone performing an important task. The bowls didn't match, the spoons were different sizes, and the napkins were paper towels torn in half because paper towels were practical and cloth napkins were for people who had time to do extra laundry. Sophie explained all of this to Grant with the seriousness of someone briefing a foreign dignitary on local customs. Clare brought the pot to the table and ladled soup into each bowl without speaking. She sat down across from Grant in the chair that didn't wobble, the one she always chose, the one that allowed her to see both the kitchen doorway and the window. Simultaneously, because Clare had spent 4 years positioned to watch every entrance and exit in every room she occupied, and the habit had become as automatic as breathing, they ate in silence for the first few minutes, the only sounds being Sophie's spoon against her bowl, and the distant rhythm of the ocean through the open kitchen window. Then Sophie, who had never met a silence she didn't feel personally responsible for filling, launched into a detailed account of a disagreement that had erupted during recess regarding the proper rules of a game whose name she couldn't quite remember, but whose injustice she felt with passionate clarity. Clare listened with the half-attention of a parent who has heard 1,000 such accounts and knows that the details matter less than the telling. But Grant noticed that she glanced at him once, twice, 3 times during Sophie's monologue, small flicks of her eyes that checked his face the way someone checks a weather report, looking for signs of what might be coming. He kept his expression warm and attentive and aimed entirely at Sophie, because he understood that he was being evaluated not on how he behaved toward Clare, but on how he behaved toward their daughter when Clare was watching. This was the test. Not grand gestures or declarations, or the kind of sweeping romantic resolution that stories usually build toward. The test was this: soup on a Wednesday, listening to a 6-year-old's grievances about a game with rules nobody understood, being present in the way that presence actually means, which is to say, being bored and uncomfortable and patient and there. After dinner, Sophie asked if Grant would read to her before bed. Clare, who had been clearing the bowls, went still. Her hand hovered over the table, a bowl suspended between the surface and the sink, and Grant could see the calculation happening in real time, the weighing of risk against need, of precedent against instinct. "Please, Mama?" Sophie added, deploying the word with the strategic precision of a child who has learned exactly when and how to use it. "1 book," Clare said, "and then teeth and bed." Sophie selected a book from the shelf in her room, a paperback so well loved that the cover had separated from the spine and was held in place by a rubber band. She climbed into bed, arranged her blankets with specific attention to the position of each stuffed animal, and patted the space beside her. Grant sat on the edge of the bed that was too small for him, his knees pressed awkwardly against the frame, his shoulders hunched to fit the low ceiling of the room that had been converted from what was probably a closet or a storage space in the cottage's original layout. Sophie's bedroom was tiny, barely large enough for the bed and a small bookshelf, but every inch of it was hers. Drawings covered the walls, taped up with loops of masking tape, each one signed Sophie A. in crayon. A line of sea glass sat on the windowsill, arranged by color, green to blue to white, catching the last light of evening. And under the bed, just visible if you tilted your head at the right angle, was a small cardboard box, empty, waiting. The box she had made for his letters. The letters that never came. Grant opened the book and began to read. His voice filled the small room, and Sophie pressed closer against his side, her breathing gradually slowing, her eyelids growing heavy. Claire stood in the doorway behind them, leaning against the frame, her arms crossed but loosely now, her expression holding something Grant hadn't seen there before, something that might have been the very beginning of peace. Sophie was asleep before the chapter ended. Grant lowered his voice to a whisper, then stopped, marking the page with a corner fold. He sat for a moment in the near dark, listening to his daughter breathe, feeling the warmth of her small body against his side, and understanding with perfect, devastating clarity what he had missed. Not the milestones, not the first words or the first steps or the first day of school, though he had missed all of those and would carry that loss forever. What he had missed was this, the ordinary moments, the soup and the spiderweb stories and the rubber-banded book, and the act of sitting in a room too small for his body while a child who shared his eyes fell asleep, trusting him enough to close them. He stood carefully, adjusting Sophie's blanket, and turned to find Clare still in the doorway. She didn't move. He didn't try to pass. They stood facing each other in the narrow hallway, close enough that he could see the tired lines around her eyes and the silver threads at her temples, and the place where the missing button left a gap in her cardigan. "Thank you," Grant said quietly. Claire nodded once. Then she stepped aside to let him pass, and he walked through the hallway and out the screen door and into the night, and behind him he heard Claire's voice, soft enough that he almost missed it. "Same time tomorrow?" Grant stopped on the porch steps. He turned back. Claire stood in the doorway, backlit by the warm yellow glow of the hallway light, and her face held something that was not yet trust, not yet forgiveness, but was no longer the careful armor of the past 3 weeks. It was an opening, a crack in the wall, a question that contained within its 3 small words the possibility that tomorrow might look different from today. "Same time tomorrow," Grant said, and he meant it the way he had never meant anything in his life. "Let me tell you something about that moment." Claire didn't say, "You can come back." She said, "Same time tomorrow." She borrowed his words. The words he had been saying to Sophie every afternoon on the bench, the promise of return, the commitment to consistency. She took those words and gave them back to him, and in doing so she acknowledged something she hadn't been ready to acknowledge before, that his daily presence had registered, that the showing up had been noticed, that the water on the porch railing and the open door and the 4th slice of bread were not random acts of hospitality but deliberate, measured steps in a direction she was choosing to move. She wasn't forgiving him. Not yet. She was watching him, and what she was seeing was starting to change the story she had told herself for 4 years. But here's where I need you to lean in, because what happens next changes everything. The following morning, Grant was walking the beach at dawn, turning a piece of green sea glass between his fingers, when his phone rang. He had kept the phone mostly silent since arriving in Bellevue, checking it once a day for anything urgent from his legal team, and otherwise letting it sit forgotten in the cottage. The world he had left behind in Manhattan felt increasingly distant, like a television show he had stopped watching mid-season, still aware that it existed but no longer invested in the plot. The call was from his attorney, a man named David Webb, who had worked with Grant for 12 years and who never called before 9 in the morning unless something was genuinely wrong. "Have you seen the Herald this morning?" David asked, and his voice carried the particular tension of someone delivering news they know will cause damage. "I'm on a beach," Grant said. "I haven't seen anything. You need to see this. I'm sending you the link now." Grant pulled the phone from his ear and opened the message, a link to the Herald's business section. He tapped it, and the page loaded slowly on Bellevue's unreliable cellular signal, the headline appearing first in bold black text before the rest of the article filled in below it. Holloway Capital CEO abandons empire for secret family, inside the billionaire's hidden life. Grant read the headline twice, then he read the article. It was devastating, not because it was false, but because it was true, selectively, strategically, toxically true. The kind of truth that tells only the facts that serve a particular narrative and omits every fact that might complicate it. The article described Grant's abrupt departure from Manhattan, his extended absence from Holloway Capital's offices, the unnamed, small coastal town where he was reportedly spending his days. The existence of a child, unnamed but described in enough detail that anyone who knew Sophie would recognize her. And the woman, also unnamed, described as a former romantic partner who had fled the relationship years ago under circumstances that remain unclear. The source was anonymous, but Grant didn't need a name. He knew exactly who had picked up the phone and called the Herald. He knew exactly who had framed this story with the precise mixture of fact and insinuation that would cause maximum damage while maintaining deniability. He knew because Renata Voss had spent 8 years learning how he thought, how he operated, how he protected the things he cared about. And she had used every piece of that knowledge to construct an article designed to do one thing: bring the outside world crashing into Bellevue. Grant stood on the beach with the sea glass in one hand and his phone in the other, the dawn light painting the water gold and pink, and he understood with cold clarity that the fragile thing he was building, the bench and the soup and the bedtime stories and the slow, patient accumulation of trust, was about to be tested in ways he hadn't prepared for. Because reporters would come, cameras would follow, the quiet streets named after shells would fill with strangers carrying notebooks and telephoto lenses, and Sophie's school with its paper stars in the windows would become a backdrop for a story that had nothing to do with a 6-year-old girl and everything to do with the appetites of a public that devours the private lives of wealthy men the way fire devours dry wood. And Clare, who had spent 4 years building a life small enough to protect and quiet enough to hide in, would look at the cameras and the headlines and the destruction of every boundary she had carefully constructed, and she would have every reason in the world to take Sophie and run again. Grant closed his eyes. The ocean kept its rhythm, the gulls called overhead, and somewhere in a white apartment on East 73rd Street, Renata Voss sat in front of her computer, reading the article she had orchestrated, watching the first cracks appear in the life of the man she claimed to love. The storm is here, and nobody in Bellevue is ready for what it brings. If you need to know what happens when the cameras arrive at Sophie's school, when Clare reads that headline, when Grant has to choose between protecting his family and fighting for his empire, then Part 3 is where everything collides. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because you do not want to miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Thank you for walking through this story with me, through the kitchen and the soup and the bedtime book, and the moment when Clare borrowed Grant's words and gave them back to him as something new. These characters are living in my head the way I hope they're living in yours, and I promise you their story is far from over. I'll see you in Part 3. Remember to always stay golden.